Hey guys, welcome back to the channel and welcome back to learning how to re-gear your 14-bolt axle. Now you hopefully watched the prior video about setting up the carrier for our 14-bolt, and we now have that at the point where we can essentially drop it back into our housing. And we're going to talk today about how to uninstall the factory pinion, put back in your new pinion with new bearings, and set up pinion bearing preload. So check it out. All right guys, and just like in the first video, we need some specialized tools to make sure this job goes smoothly. So I will link to all of these in the description, just like I do in all my videos, but one of the first ones we're gonna need is our press, just like we used in the last video. Also, like the last video, we're gonna need our clamshell bearing removal tool. We're gonna need an impact gun. Now, if our seal comes out nice and easy, all you need is a seal removal tool. But if it doesn't, we need a screwdriver that you don't mind using, like a chisel. So make sure the tip on it isn't, something you want to use for actually backing out screws. We're gonna need a pair of pliers potentially. I like to use vice grips in that instance, but any real pair of pliers that you can get some leverage on will work just fine. And you might need to use a hammer. Now we're gonna need two different style torque wrenches. You're gonna need one that goes up pretty high for that pinion nut when we get to it, but you're also gonna need an inch-pound torque wrench with a dial indicator readout on it. You don't want the click type or a digital type. We're gonna need a bearing driver set. We're also gonna need a pair of calipers to measure our shim pack thickness. Now, you're gonna have to also make sure that you have a master install kit ready to go so that you have the appropriate bearings and shims and all that kind of stuff for your new pinion. In this case, I've used the Yukon Gear and Axle master install kit. I like theirs because it comes with real high quality bearings and it basically has everything in the kit that you need. The one thing this kit didn't, or two things that this kit did not come with, is a new yoke. Now, the new yoke we're gonna have to swap out because the factory 14-bolt pinion yoke is a little bit too big. We're using a 1350 U-joint on our drive shaft, so we needed the proper corresponding pinion yoke. Now there are two different designs of pinion yoke for the 14-bolt and each one takes a different seal. The Yukon kit comes with one style. I will put the part number for the other style in the video description and I'll let you know which one I use with our 1350 yoke. Now, the other thing that we're gonna be using is a crush sleeve eliminator. That is something that did not come with the master install kit. The master install kit actually comes with two crush sleeves, but we're going to eliminate that and use this in a shim pack instead. I'll talk about that when we get to it. All right, now one of the first things you're going to want to do to your pinion is make sure that you remove the shim that went between the pinion carrier and the axle housing. Hold on to this shim because we're going to want to measure it and make sure that we know its thickness for later. Now, the next step is going to be to remove your pinion yoke. When we remove that, we're going to use the same 1.5 inch impact socket that we were using on top of our bearing removal tool and our impact gun. Usually this will come right off. Obviously it depends on the condition of your axle. You'll definitely need an impact. It's tight, okay? Especially if this carrier has the crush sleeve in it. It takes a lot of torque to crush one of those down, but grab it with your hand, grab it with a big, like a big monkey wrench or a pipe wrench, and it should come right off. Now you're gonna wanna hold on to your old pinion nut as well, so let's put that off to the side. All right guys, after you have that pinion nut off and stuck off to the side, the next part is gonna be pressing the pinion out of the carrier. Now this is the downside to being that DIY guy that didn't spend a ton of money on a really big press, because when you have a smaller press, the the bottom plates basically on the press are not wide enough apart. Heavier presses, there's more space down here, and you can't actually have enough space to let the pinion fall between these two bottom supports. So you kind of have to rig something up with wood or blocks or whatever in order to wind up giving yourself enough room for the pinion to drop out the bottom. So we've done that here. We're gonna give it a shot. Well, here it goes. You can see it. You can see the thread slowly moving if you look real close. And it's starting to come. It's going to drop right in the bottom. You'll see it in a second. And there we go. Pinion is out. Now that our pinion is obviously pressed out of the carrier, we have to remove the races and bearing from the carrier. You'll notice that this bearing here is going to be on this pinion, and we're actually never going to remove it. We're starting with a new pinion. We'll press on a new bearing. And because our 14 bolt is externally shimmed with the pinion, we actually don't have any shims in this bearing to control how deep the pinion rides inside the carrier. It's kind of nice. It makes it a lot simpler to set up. Now, there is a crush sleeve on here, and we will talk about that later when it comes time to do the crush sleeve eliminator and why the crush sleeve eliminator is better. But for now, we're going to move on, and we're going to make sure that we start pulling the seal, the races, and the remaining bearing, the outer bearing, off of the carrier. So this is where we're going to try to use our seal puller, but to be honest with you, this is a pretty old axle. I'm not expecting the seal to start coming out with our seal puller, but we're going to give it a shot. We're going to pry on it, see if there's any movement at all. So we're going to hook it under the seal. Try the other side. Yeah, and guys, it's just so stuck in there, it's not gonna work. We're gonna have to go back to using a screwdriver and a hammer to kind of pry the edges up, grab it with a pair of pliers, pull it out. Here we go, guys. Sometimes the hammer and screwdriver trick works. Now, obviously, we destroyed and deformed this pinion seal, but we're not gonna use it again anyway. It doesn't matter. And you saw that it made very quick work of it. Now inside we have our outer bearing, and it is just sitting in there. So we're gonna pull that out. We're gonna set that off to the side on top of a rag because it does have some gear oil in it and it'll make a mess. And as you can see down inside here, we have the race for that bearing that we just pulled out, the outer bearing. Now we're gonna use a pretty large brass punch and a hammer to just knock those out. Okay, so we've repositioned our carrier in the vise here, and now we're gonna do the same thing with our punch and our hammer to knock the other race out the other side. At this point in time, we've opened up our Yukon gear and axle package, and we're gonna press on our new inner pinion bearing. Because once that goes on, it never has to come off. That pinion bearing goes on, like I said earlier, with no shims between it and the pinion gear, and it will allow us to move forward with our regear. But really quick, check this out. Check out the difference in the pinion head size on our new Yukon gear and axle pinion, which I've cleaned with brake cleaner. They come coated in oil, but it's already clean and dry and ready to move forward. This guy is much bigger, and that's because we are going with a 538 ring and pinion versus the factory 410. Now, if you've watched my other videos talking about ring gear sizes and axles, you know that as we re-gear to a numerically higher number, that contact patch between the ring and pinion gets smaller. But a 14 bolt is still a massive axle. So even though that 538 is smaller than that 410, it is still a massively large contact patch, and it's definitely strong enough for our purposes and even if you wanted to run a lot more horsepower than we are with our Jeep. So let's press on that pinion bearing. At this point, we've put a little gear oil on the surface of the pinion where the bearing is going to sit. We've also put a little bit of it inside of the inner pinion bearing. We're going to set that pinion bearing down on top of the pinion. Make sure it's kind of nice and level on there. As you can see, there's like a beveled edge on this pinion. So you just kind of want to set it down, make sure it's on there nice and level. So you can see here that the bearing is made out of a couple of different pieces. We have our outer cage, we have the inner race, and then we have an outer race that sits on the top. Well, this inner race is what we want to use when we are pressing this on. We never want to press on the cage or the bearing themselves or even the outer race. So what we're going to do in order to find something that will fit directly over this is use our clamshell bearing tool. The inner diameter of this tool is actually the perfect diameter to sit on that inner race and press our bearing on. Now that we have the new bearing on the pinion, we are going to press our race that goes with that bearing into our carrier. Now, you heard me talk before about pressing the bearing onto the pinion and how we only wanted to press on that inner race, never on the outer race. Well, the same situation is true. So the way we're going to press on the outer race to get it into our carrier is to set it in there and get it as straight and as level as possible. Sometimes you can start to work it in with like a rubber mallet, but I find that to be extremely difficult. So what I do is I just rest it in there. I rest it in there as straight as possible. I take my old race, I set it on top of the new one, and then I take a bearing driver and set that inside of the old race. That way we're pressing on the inside of the old race, which we don't care if we damage, and then we're pressing on the outer ring of the new race to get it into the carrier, preserving that bearing surface of the new race. Let's get to it. All right, now as you start to press this in, you're gonna wanna make sure that that first race, that new race, is going in nice and evenly. So you wanna use very little pressure, because the last thing that you want to happen is for this race to start to go in crooked. And if it does, you have to catch it immediately and then take it out with a brass punch, being careful not to drop it on the floor so that you can start over. But let's see what we can do here. So far, so good. We are now set up with our new race. I've given it a look from the backside right down in here at this edge where my finger is to make sure that there's no gap and that there's no gap all the way around the inside, just to make sure that it's seated all the way. Let's jump to the next step. Okay, so we flipped the carrier over and now it's time to press the race into the other side. So we're gonna take our new race, we're going to set it in there. Now you can tell that this race sits a lot deeper inside of the carrier. So we don't want to use the old race like we just did to push in the new race, because there is the potential that that old race can also be pressed back in a tiny bit, and we don't want to do that. So what we're going to do is use our old bearing, okay, our old outer yoke bearing. We're going to set that in there, all right? And then that way it kind of uses the old bearing inside of the new race to wind up pressing it in. And then we're going to stick a bearing driver on the inner race of the old bearing to press it in. Guys, this is kind of what part of regearing is, in making sure that you get all of your bearings and everything pressed in correctly and straight and evenly. It's a little bit of a tedious process, but none of it is hard, okay? But you do pay a shop a lot of money to do this kind of stuff for you when, again, it's not all that hard. It's just a bunch of steps, and as long as each step is done correctly, you'll have an awesome gear set. All right, guys, so I checked that bearing race exactly the same way I checked the other one, and we are almost done. At this point, we have to take the carrier bearing out of the housing and replace it with a new one from our master install kit. Once that's done, we can move on to setting bearing preload on that pinion and putting it all back together and dropping it in the housing. All right, for this bearing, you're gonna basically punch it out through the hole in the pinion, and I'm just gonna use a socket with an extension and knock it out. Okay, at this point, we have the old bearing out. We're gonna take our new bearing, set it in from the pinion side, use the appropriate sized bearing driver to push on the outside race, and we're gonna hammer it in. All right, guys, so now we are at the last step in our pinion assembly process, and that is setting up our pinion bearing preload. Now, let's step on over to those pinions, and I will show you exactly how to think about pinion bearing preload, which might make this a little bit easier for you, especially if you haven't done it before. Now, here's how the factory gets, or most people get, a perfect result. They take their bearing off, and then they have in between what's called a crush sleeve. Now, this crush sleeve you can see is kind of crushed to the point where it kind of starts to bulge out in the center. And basically that is what you use to set your pinion bearing preload in most applications. And you can use it on a 14 bolt, but there are some downsides to that. If you over crush it, you'll have too much pressure on your bearings, too much preload, and you'll have to start over by unpressing that bearing, swapping it out for a new crush sleeve, and starting over. You can also ruin it by, in the future, changing out a pinion seal. If you have to take your nut and your yoke off to change out a leaking seal, if you over tighten that pinion nut, you can crush that sleeve too far and mess up your preload again years later, even if it was right the first time. So we're going to avoid that by using a crush sleeve eliminator. Now you can see the difference here between that, like we just said, all bulged out, and our crush sleeve eliminator. Now this will not bulge out when we compress it. So the way we're going to get the right measurement and the right height on this piece of steel here is by using a shim pack. Now the shims and the crush sleeve eliminator, they are an added expense. They are not something that comes in your master install kit, but they are highly worth it, because in the future, if you need to change a pinion seal, you don't have to worry about over tightening that pinion nut and losing your bearing preload. Once it's set, okay? It's never going to change. Now, a 14 bolt axle, because of this carrier bearing, does not have what's called pinion deflection. I'm not going to get into what the definition of that is and what the causes of it are in order to keep this video short. But pinion deflection, which happens in off-road vehicles or high horsepower applications, can sometimes affect that crush sleeve, which is why we are going to use a crush sleeve eliminator. Now, the first step to getting this right is to read the instructions. Now, that book came with your new ring and pinion, and inside of it, you're gonna see a chart that's gonna show you what the correct bearing preload and shim thicknesses are across a lot of different axles. Our 14 bolt is listed just here. Now, inside of that book, it said that for new bearings, it also has measurements for used bearings, but we're gonna go with new. So for new bearings, we need between 20 and 35 inch-pounds of preload on our pinion bearings. Here's how we're gonna set it up. The first step in basically determining the crush sleeve eliminator and the pack thickness that we need for our new pinion and new bearings is to basically use the old pinion crush sleeve as a baseline. So we're going to use the digital calipers that I mentioned earlier in the video, and I will definitely link to these in the description. We're going to turn it on, make sure it's closed, zero it out, and then measure our crush sleeve. And we are at 0.835. Take that measurement, write it down. Now we're going to take our crush sleeve eliminator after cleaning it, because a little bit of oil on here will throw off your measurement. It's actually amazing how much it can throw off your measurement. And we are at 0.740. You saw me write those things down, and that's a really important step in this process. This is going to bring you back to, you know, elementary school math, basically, because we're going to need to keep track of all this stuff. So you're going to want to make sure that you keep everything written down. I like to write down what my factory specs are on the inch pounds. That way I don't have to go back to the instruction booklet and try to search for it in that table. I wrote down our crush sleeve measurement. I wrote down our eliminator measurement. Now, the way we're going to know how to basically set up our factory shim pack is going to be to subtract and find the difference between those two measurements. I did that here, and we are at 95 thousandths. So these shims are going to be all different thicknesses. I'm going to measure them each separately, okay? Do not stack them together and measure it out, because you will get a different measurement if then you measure them separately and add them together. You want to make sure that they're clean with brake cleaner. Again, no oil, no contaminants. Measure all of them, and then build a shim pack that is going to be at 0.095, 95 thousandths, or even add on a couple, right? Because we're using new bearings, you might even want to go a little higher than that, maybe 97 thousandths, something like that. And it should get you pretty close to the proper bearing preload rating. So I've taken a few minutes, I've basically worked it out a couple of different ways, and when we put our crush sleeve onto the pinion along with the shim stack I have put together, we are now a couple of thousandths bigger than our original crush sleeve, which should help, being that we are going with new bearings and the old ones were obviously not new bearings. Now, I do want to set this up on the lower side of the preload rating from what they recommend, because we're not going to test this with our pinion seal. And in a few minutes, you'll understand why. But we're going to take that over, bring it to the press with our carrier, press that bearing on, and then head over to the vise and test it. Okay, so we have our pinion back in the press. We're going to take our carrier with the new races installed, set it down on top of the pinion. We're going to then take our new bearing, slide that down on top, and then use our clamshell bearing tool, because if we remember, the diameter of this is perfect to sit on this inner race, and press that bearing on. Now again, just like the last bearings, when you get this started, you're going to want to go nice and easy to make sure that you are pressing that bearing on straight. It should go on pretty easily, and you just want to push it until it seats. So we have our pinion back in the vise. We've slid on our new 1350 yoke. We use our old pinion washer and pinion nut. We're not going to use the new one until we're ready for final assembly. Now, we don't have a pinion seal in here. And the reason for that is because we're probably going to have to put this together and press it apart a number of times in order to get the pinion preload where we want it to be. I don't want to have to keep putting in new seals and pulling out new seals after I damage them, so we're going to wait and do it at the end. But that's also why I said a few minutes ago that I want to make sure I set this pinion preload at the absolute low end, maybe even lower than the low end, because as soon as I put that pinion seal in there, it is going to increase the inch-pound measurement in this pinion. So let's button this up, let's tighten it down. I'll show you how to torque it correctly to keep it consistent each time you do it, and then we will move on. At this point, we're going to want to torque this pinion nut down, and I'm going to use the wrench to hold it while I pull on it with the torque wrench. Okay, so now you want to use your inch-pound torque wrench with the dial indicator. You want to put it on and then measure the resistance, but I can already tell you that it just plain doesn't have any. So at this point, what I'm going to do is take the pinion out in its carrier. First I'll spin the nut off. I'll take the pinion out. We'll go back to the press. We'll press the pinion out of the carrier like we did the first time around with our old pinion bearings. And then I will bring it back over there and figure out a new shim pack that is a little bit smaller. I'll probably knock off about 3 thousandths and then we'll try it again, right? That's 0.003 less. Now guys, this is exactly what I'm talking about with this taking so long. Once you build that shim pack and you put it in there, you have to get this just right. And 3 thousandths difference will make a big difference. Let's check it out. Okay guys, so we've adjusted the shim pack. We had no preload, so we decreased the amount of shims to decrease the amount of distance between the bearings so that they squeeze the races harder. And at this point, it feels way better than it did before. So we're gonna get our inch-pound dial indicator on that pinion nut. We're gonna give it a spin and just see what it reads at. Keep in mind that the specs call for 20 to 35 inch-pounds. All right, we got our pinion, we got our inch-pound meter on that pinion, and again, not the initial, because you will get a little bit of a spike, but the continuous. And I don't know if you can see that there, but we are almost at 20, which, to be honest with you, is kind of where I want to be, because it's a little bit low, but you got to remember, when we add that pinion seal, it's going to give us some resistance. So we're going to take it apart. We're going to get that pinion seal in there, and then we're going to put it back together, check it one more time, and see where we are at. Earlier in the video, I mentioned how there were 2 different styles of pinion seal, and I know here they probably look almost the same, but this one has a larger inner diameter for a larger yoke, and this one is smaller. This one came with our master install kit, because all master install kits are designed expecting you to basically re-gear a factory axle and not make a ton of changes. Maybe the gear ratio, but that's about it. That's why it has crush sleeves in it, not a crush sleeve eliminator. That was an added cost, like we said earlier. And because we switched to a 1350 style yoke, we have to go with the smaller diameter, because you can see that our yoke actually fits in there nice and tight. And if we put it in the other one, there's all sorts of play in there. So if we were actually able to press that in, hook it up with the one that came in our master install package, there would be a lot of play, and you would have gear oil gushing out of your housing every time you drove your vehicle. Obviously, that wouldn't be good. Now I will link to, or I'll at least put the part number in the video description. Now, in order to put this pinion seal down inside of here, I'm going to put a very thin film all the way around, basically down here in this crevice, okay? Because this flat surface here on the edge is what's going to mate to this flat surface here once we hammer it in with a rubber mallet. So I'm going to use a high quality RTV. I like to use Permatex Ultra Black. It's got a very high temperature and high oil resistance to it. We're going to hammer that in, then put it all back together and recheck our pinion bearing preload. We have to hammer it in evenly. So what I like to do is put a block of wood on top of the seal and then hit it with a mini sledge and just kind of start to tap it in nicely, go to the opposite side, work it in nicely, and continue to do that all the way around until our seal is pressed in. I already took the new yoke, I put a little bit of gear oil on that gasket surface, and I slid it on. Now we're going to take some gear oil and put it back on our pinion nut washer. These kits usually don't come with a new pinion yoke washer, so you can certainly reuse your old one. We're going to take a fair amount of red thread lock and put that on the threads of our pinion. We're going to take our new pinion nut, assuming this is the last time we're going to put it together. Get that started. All right, We're gonna send it home with the impact gun. All right, I can already feel that that is really nice. All right, guys, so I know it's not easy for you to see this, so I'm checking it now. Remember, it's not the initial movement to get it started, it's the continuous, and we are within spec. So at this point, because we added the seal, remember before I added the seal, we were just under the minimum, which is 20 inch-pounds. And because I've now added the seal, even lubing it up a little bit with a little gear oil, it still jumped up to about 28 inch-pounds. So at 28 inch-pounds, I'm really happy with that. We're well within spec. Guys, congratulations, all right? Give yourselves a pat on the back because you have now completed the second gigantic step in regearing your 14 bolt. Obviously, if you watched the first video, that was the first step. This is the second. There are only 3. So stay tuned for that video where I show you guys how to put everything back together inside of the housing and get a good gear pattern. That will ensure that your axle lives a long, healthy life and that you guys have plenty of fun with your freshly built 1 ton. Now guys, make sure you like this video. Make sure you subscribe to the channel because that's what YouTube cares about, and that's how I make a couple of cents and can keep doing future builds and things like that. Share it with a friend, drop a comment, hit the Instagram, you know the drill. Get out there and build something.